One, two, one, two. Good evening. Good evening. We'll be starting the program in about 3 minutes. So I see the wine has arrived if you want to go get something and refreshments. You'll sign books afterwards.
Yes, we're having some trouble, but I always making this thing work.
Have you ever done it before?
Lots of times.
Oh.
And I always start off with trouble until we figure out what's the matter. I went over one of my editors is the guy who knows how it all works. So I went over it carefully with him today. She's never done it before, and she might not have been getting it quite right. But so afterwards, I'll get her started. It's very easy. Once it's working, you go click, 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 ding, it's done.
Hi, Colleen.
I'm probably going to miss you at the end. I have a dear friend, Veronica Marywell,
Oh, yes, of course.
and she said to me, "Oh, Colleen, you're going to love this."
Oh, well, I hope not disappoint. Thank you.
Judith. Good. Shall we? Ready? I'm gonna.
A lot of people are watching live stream, though.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. I am Father Michael Hilbert, Associate Pastor, and on behalf of our pastor, Father Yesalona, and the whole parishioner of the parish community, I welcome you to this Laetare lecture for 2025, the third in our lecture series, a central part of our parish's celebration of the Jubilee Year of Hope, and has as its theme, Pilgrims of Hope. Pope Francis has called for this Jubilee year, citing St. Paul's letter to the Romans. Since we are justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we boast in our hope of sharing in the glory of God. Hope does not disappoint, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit, that has been given to us. Hope does not disappoint. As Pope Francis wrote in his decree formally proclaiming the Jubilee, and I quote, "Sustained by this great tradition, I am certain that this Jubilee year will be for the entire Church a lively experience of grace and hope." A special welcome and thanks to the members of the Dorothy Day Guild, through whose generosity this lecture is being live streamed. Thank you very much. The Laetare lecture, given on the day after Laetare Sunday, is considered the high point in our lecture series, and we are honored to have Mr. Robert Ellsberg as our speaker this evening. We are thrilled that Robert will speak on the long pilgrimage of Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, lived a life shaped by radical hospitality, social justice, and an unwavering commitment to the gospel, to her Lord and God. Describing her own path as a pilgrimage, she faced profound tests of faith, both in the struggles of daily life and in the turbulent challenges of history. Her cause for canonization is now in Rome, having been concluded here in the Archdiocese. And be sure to take a prayer card for her canonization as you leave, or perhaps you already have. We have other literature for you at the table at the front, an excerpt from a book by Robert, and then a prayer card and a survey, I think it is. What was it? A petition that we ask you to take with you and fill out. Robert Ellsberg, the publisher of Orbis Books, worked with Dorothy Day. He knows her for about 50 years, and worked with her during the last 5 years of her life, serving for 2 years as managing editor of the Catholic Worker. He has spent much of his life promoting her life and legacy, including editing 6 volumes of her writings, most recently, Dorothy Day, Spiritual Writings. An excerpt of that book was published in America Magazine last November and is offered, as I said, as a gift by the author. And the book itself is available for sale and for signing by the author. Join me in welcoming Mr. Robert Ellsberg.
Thank you very much, Father, and all of you for coming out this evening. I'm still in a very much a Laetare mood since receiving the coveted Loyola Medal yesterday at Mass. I was very moved and honored by that recognition, which, as I said yesterday, I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of the saints, those that I've known and those that I've written about. But tonight I'll be talking about Dorothy Day. I'm very glad to be able to do that. I always am. Beginnings are always exciting. Those are the opening words of Dorothy Day's book, Loaves and Fishes, one of her accounts of the Catholic Worker Movement. The exciting beginning of the movement occurred at a communist rally in Union Square on May 1st, 1933, when Dorothy and a few of her comrades distributed the first issue of the Catholic Worker newspaper. The date was chosen deliberately, May 1st, International Workers' Day. Later, it would also be designated by Pope Pius XII as the feast of St. Joseph the Worker. Dorothy describes the excitement of this beginning. The day was bright and warm and beautiful. The square was packed with demonstrators and paraders, listening to speeches, carrying on disputes among themselves, or glancing through the great masses of literature being given out or sold, which soon were litter on the ground. Among those who gave the paper a glance, there were surely few who shared Dorothy's excitement, nor could she even have imagined that this was the beginning of a movement that would have wide impact throughout the church, that it would signal the beginning of a lay apostolate that connected the works of mercy with the struggle for justice and peace, or that its editor, the 35-year-old Catholic convert who had taken to Union Square on this bright, warm, and beautiful day, would one day be eulogized as the most interesting, influential, and important Catholic in American history, and possibly a future saint. Beginnings are always exciting. But behind every beginning, there are always many other beginnings. 6 months before the launch of the first issue of the newspaper, there was Dorothy's encounter with Peter Morin, an itinerant French peasant philosopher who encouraged her to start a newspaper that would promote the radical social message of the gospel. And before that, there was her prayer at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. on December 8th, 1932, a prayer offered, quote, with tears and with anguish, that she would find some way to combine her faith with her commitment to the cause of the oppressed. And before that, there was her decision, after finding herself pregnant, to have her child baptized, a step she followed, though it meant separation from the man she loved, the father of her child, when he refused to marry her. But how far back to go with these decisive moments, these beginnings? In her youth, Dorothy writes of being moved by the stories of the saints and their charity toward the poor and the sick. But even then, she says, she was troubled by a question. Why was so much done in remedying the evil instead of avoiding it in the first place? Where were the saints to change the social order, not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery? You could say that Dorothy's life was an answer to those questions. And perhaps even in those questions lay one of the many beginnings of her vocation. The novelist Graham Greene wrote, "There is always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in." I don't think those moments are confined to childhood, nor is there only one. We don't necessarily recognize their significance at the time. Sometimes they might even feel more like endings. But Dorothy's faith was deeply rooted in her reflection on such moments and the wider story of which they were a part. She believed in her life story, pondering and meditating on it throughout her life as a kind of spiritual text, a kind of personal proof for the existence of God. Along with the gospel story, it was the foundation of her faith. She could have resonated with the words of St. Augustine as he looked back on his life from the standpoint of his conversion and said, "All the while, far above, your mercy hovered fully about me." She told this story in 2 memoirs, From Union Square to Rome in 1938, and a longer version in The Long Loneliness in 1952. In both cases, she was eager to relate those events, encounters, and experiences in her early life that brought her to the knowledge of God. Chief among these was her engagement with the cause of the poor and the struggle for social justice. Quote, "Because I sincerely loved his poor, he taught me to know him. And when I think of the little I ever did, I am filled with hope and love for all those others devoted to the cause of social justice." But there were many other experiences along the way. Later, quoting a character from her favorite writer, Dostoevsky, she would write, "All my life, I have been haunted by God." And yet there was seemingly nothing inevitable about her decision to become a Catholic. She had been raised in a nominally Protestant family in which, quote, "the name of God was never mentioned, and to speak of the soul was to speak immodestly, uncovering what might better remain hidden." Her father, a sports writer who later described Dorothy as the nut of the family, believed that only Irish cops and washerwomen were Catholics. She was baptized in the Episcopal Church at the age of 12, but put aside any religious impulses during her 2 years in college. She wrote, "Religion, as it was practiced by those I encountered, had no vitality. It had nothing to do with everyday life. It was a matter of Sunday praying. Christ no longer walked the streets of this world. He was 2,000 years dead, and new prophets had risen up in his place." Dropping out of college after her second year, she moved to New York City and found work with a series of left-wing journals, including the New York Call, which was a socialist paper, and the Masses. Her friends were socialists, radicals, literary bohemians who regarded religion as the opiate of the people. One of her particularly close friends became a founder of the Communist Party. She wrote about her arrest with suffragists in Washington and the dejection she experienced in her brief stints in jail when, quote, the sorrows of the world encompassed her. And she was, quote, like one gone down into the pit. She wrote of late nights in saloons listening to Eugene O'Neill recite The Hound of Heaven. It was, quote, one of those poems that awakens the soul, recalls to it the fact that God is its destiny. And sometimes, after one of those all-night sessions in a tavern nicknamed Hellhole by its patrons, she would make her way to St. Joseph's Church in Greenwich Village and kneel in one of the back pews, quote, not knowing what was going on at the altar, but warmed and comforted by the lights and silence, the kneeling people, and the atmosphere of worship. One of her radical friends later said, Dorothy was always too religious to be a communist. In any case, her own life by this time had come to feel sordid, and yet she said, I had occasional glimpses of the true and the beautiful. Soon after, she would withdraw from her social set and enroll as a student nurse at Brooklyn Hospital, which at the time was overflowing with victims of the Spanish flu pandemic. It was there that she met a newspaperman with whom she had a passionate affair that resulted in her becoming pregnant. Feeling desperate, she had an abortion, which almost killed her. Afterwards, she says she twice tried to commit suicide. This episode falls under the category of stories she did not describe in her memoirs, referring only to experiences of, quote, the tragic aspect of life in general. If Dorothy is one day canonized, there's no doubt she will be a saint with an unusual backstory. As she wrote in her diary, aside from drug addiction, I committed all the sins that young people commit today. Yet even the circumstances of her conversion are unique in the annals of the saints. This occurred while she was living on Staten Island with a man she deeply loved and discovered that she was once again pregnant. His name was Forster, a soft-spoken anarchist with a great love of science and nature. With him, she began to feel that she was coming back to life, and in her happiness, she was surprised to find herself praying as she walked along the shore. Dorothy regarded their relationship as a common-law marriage, but Forster insisted it was just a comradeship. Even many years later, describing her feelings about Forster, she fell into a poignant rhapsody. I loved him in every way, as a wife, as a mother even. I loved him for all he knew and pitied him for all he didn't know. I loved him for the odds and ends I had to fish out of his sweater pockets, and for the sand and shells he brought in with his fishing. I loved his lean, cold body as he got into bed smelling of the sea, and I loved his integrity and stubborn pride. That's a paragraph you will not find in Augustine's Confessions. What Dorothy termed this period of natural happiness was exponentially magnified when she discovered that she was once again pregnant. Following the complications from her earlier abortion, she had believed she couldn't have a child. Now her gratitude was so great, she said, that only God could receive it. And in this joy, she knew that she wanted to have her child baptized. Why the Catholic Church? She believed that the Catholic Church, for all its failures, was the church of the poor. She believed it would give her child a sense of order and discipline that she had lacked in her own life. She was attracted by its appeal to the senses, the sacramental sense, that God's grace is transmitted through nature, through bread and wine and beauty. Not knowing any actual Catholics, she approached a sister of charity walking along the beach and asked for her help. But here was the beginning of a great tension, because Forster was an anarchist and atheist. He had no use for religion, and he would have nothing to do with marriage by church or state. So Dorothy knew that if she became a Catholic, as seemed increasingly inevitable, it would mean separating herself from the man she loved and the father of her child. And after her conditional baptism in 1927, that's exactly what happened. It came down, she said, to a choice between God and man. Sadly, painfully, she made her choice. In December 1927, a most miserable day, she says, she took the ferry to Staten Island and writes grimly that I had no sense of peace, no joy, no conviction even that what I was doing was right. It was just something that I had to do. Afterwards, she would not let Forster back into the house. Her suffering in this situation was compounded by a second cause, her feeling that in becoming a Catholic, she was betraying her comrades in the radical cause. If the church was the home of the poor, it also seemed all too often a defender of the status quo, a friend of the rich and powerful. I love the church for Christ made visible, she said, not for itself, because it was so often a scandal to me. Thus she embarked on a lonely path for the next 5 years, supporting her daughter as a single mother, writing articles for the Catholic press, and pursuing work as she could find it, including a stint as a writer in Hollywood and a garden columnist on Staten Island, while searching for some higher purpose. The month of December 1932, 5 years later, is when everything changed. She traveled to Washington to write about a hunger march of the unemployed, a protest organized by her former communist friends. Why were Catholics not leading such a march, she wondered. Heading for the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, it was actually December 8th, the very feast of the Immaculate Conception, maybe significant, she offered a prayer, as I said, that came with tears and anguish that she might find her vocation, some way of using her talents in the service of the poor. And when she returned to New York, she met Peter Morin, whose ideas would shape the rest of her life. This is a familiar story that Dorothy related in her memoirs, but before I describe what happened next, I'd like to pause a moment to share another dimension to this story, which I only discovered when I had the opportunity of editing her selected letters all the way to heaven. In editing this book, I was at first struck by the contrast between the letters preceding her meeting with Peter Morin and those that follow 1 year later. Whereas before she was a single mother, a struggling freelance writer trying to write stories and novels on the side, a young convert still finding her way in a church in which she admits, I still did not know personally a single Catholic layman. 1 year later, she's suddenly the confident editor of her own newspaper, the leader of a lay movement, a recognized name in both church circles and the social movements of the day. And you think, where did this person come from? One often observes this in the annals of the saints, whether in the case of Teresa of Avila or Teresa of Calcutta, that once they discover their true vocation, their whole personality is transformed. They find a vitality and focus that had previously been lacking. As Dorothy herself often said, you will know your vocation by the joy it brings you. And it occurs to me that when Dorothy met Peter Morin, her heart was like dry kindling to which he added the spark. His message would have meant nothing to her if she had not offered that prayer at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception with tears and anguish for some sign of her vocation. But the letters add a wider context for that prayer. And this becomes clearer in reading the long sequence of love letters that Dorothy wrote to Forster for the 5 years after their separation in 1927. In her memoir, she described having to face a choice between God and man and how she made her difficult choice for God. Yet the letters make it clear that this story was not as clear-cut as all that. For 5 years after separating from Forster, she continued to write to him, begging, cajoling, and enticing him to give up his stubborn pride and agree to marry her. Do I have to be condemned to celibacy all my days just because of your pig-headedness? She writes him at one point. The letters, filled with longing and erotic energy, have an almost unbearable pathos. The ache in my heart is intolerable at times, and sometimes for days I can feel your lips upon me, waking and sleeping. It's because I love you so much that I want you to marry me. I want to be in your arms every night, as I used to be, and be with you always. But in the end, she realized that this was not to be. On December 10th, 1932, she wrote what would be her final letter to Forster for many years. She spoke again of her deep love for him and her wish to marry,
But in the end, she acknowledged, quote, "It's all hopeless. I've really given up now, so I won't try to persuade you anymore." Note that this followed by only 2 days her visit to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, and it obviously offers a new context for appreciating a prayer that came with tears and anguish. In letting go of Forster, and in that same week meeting Peter Morin, it's as if one door closed while another opened on the rest of her life. But another thought occurs to us when we realize how much her vocation depended on Forster's commitment to his own principles, what she called his stubborn pride. If it had been up to Dorothy, she would have married Forster, raised a house full of children, and continued writing novels and plays. In this alternative universe, perhaps she would have found happiness, but there would have been no Catholic worker. And he realized that everything she achieved in her subsequent life occurred because of the frustration of her heart's desire. Everything she would contribute to the church and to the world, causing Pope Francis to cite her in his speech to Congress as one of the great Americans and now fuels the cause of her canonization, was built on an experience of hopelessness and surrender. To put it more personally, when I think about it, everything in my life would have been different if Dorothy had not stepped through that door. And that sheds a different light on all the twists and turns in our lives, the follies, the sins, the failures, the chances and accidents, the things that broke our hearts, the doors that closed in our faces. And to imagine that somehow God was there all along, as much as in the moments of glory. As I said at the outset, sometimes there are beginnings that look very much like endings. Dorothy closed the door on her hope of reconciling her faith with a happy married life. In surrendering that desire, she found a way to reconcile her faith with her commitment to the poor, thus connecting the two parts of her soul that had been circling each other throughout her life. It was one of those moments in which a door opens on the future, and it only remains for us to take the first step. It took a while, not at their first meeting, before Dorothy recognized that Peter Morin, with his thick French accent and shabby appearance, who proceeded to lecture her about history, the problems of the industrial age, the dignity of work, the monastic ideal of hospitality, was pointing her in the direction of her vocation. 20 years Dorothy's senior, Morin had been raised in a peasant family in southern France. Educated by the Christian Brothers, he had imbibed the spirit of social Catholicism before immigrating to North America, where he tramped about in poverty, engaging in hard labor, while devising a synthesis in the area of Catholic social philosophy. Peter Morin believed that the troubles facing the world came from substituting the bank account for the Sermon on the Mount as the ultimate standard of values. He believed Christians should begin at once to live by gospel values, building a new world within the shell of the old, a world where it would be easier for people to be good. It was not immediately clear to Dorothy how all this related to her search, yet one of his suggestions immediately caught her attention, that she start a newspaper to promote the radical social message of the gospel. Almost immediately, she got to work, and the result, just a little over 5 months later, was the Catholic Worker, an 8-page tabloid that sold then, as it does to this day, for a penny a copy. The first issue was filled initially with stories about strikes, evictions, child labor, racial injustice, and Peter Morin's own so-called easy essays. She described the purpose of the paper in her first editorial, which was written along with the rest of the paper on her kitchen table. For those who are sitting on park benches in the warm spring sunlight, for those who are huddling in shelters trying to escape the rain, for those who are walking the streets in the all but futile search for work, for those who think that there is no hope for the future, no recognition of their plight, this little paper is addressed. It's printed to call their attention to the fact that the Catholic Church has a social program, to let them know that there are men of God who are working not only for their spiritual, but for their material welfare. This link between the spiritual and the material was the foundation for the Catholic Worker. I think one of Peter's major contributions was simply to give Dorothy a kind of permission to launch her own movement. Drawing on the lives of the saints, he showed her it was not necessary to wait for anyone to authorize or sponsor the way of discipleship. The saints began immediately with whatever means were at hand. If God blessed their venture, the means would arrive. For Dorothy, this meant launching her newspaper at a communist rally on May 1st, 1933, with no money, calling it the Catholic Worker without checking or seeking prior permission from the bishop or any other authority, daring to offer a Catholic perspective on social issues of the day that was far in advance of contemporary social teaching. Other lay Catholics quickly answered her call and gathered to join the work. Before long, they had implemented the second plank in Morin's program, opening a house of hospitality where she and her fellow Catholic workers would live among the poor in voluntary poverty, practicing the works of mercy. Before meeting Morin, Dorothy says she had been searching for a synthesis of her own between the spiritual and the material, this world and the next. The solution to that synthesis, she came to realize, was in the radical implications of the Incarnation. God and Jesus had entered our flesh and our history. All of creation, the whole material world was thereby hallowed. We could not separate the love of God from the love of our neighbors. Jesus said that what we did for the poor, we did directly for him. Dorothy and Peter believed it was not enough to write about these ideas. We must live them out. And this led to other houses of hospitality for the practice of the works of mercy, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless. But she believed it was not enough simply to care for the poor. It was also necessary to challenge, protest, and resist the structures that cause such poverty and the need for charity, particularly the spirit of financial speculation, the valuation of capital and property over labor, and the diversion of resources to militarism. It was not enough just to bind up the wounds of the slaves. She wanted to do away with slavery, with injustice, with racism, with war and violence. And she and Peter also believed it was not enough just to protest and agitate about social injustice. Articles in the Catholic Worker also held out a positive vision of an alternative world, a society organized around values of solidarity, community, and human dignity instead of selfishness and greed. What would the world look like if we truly recognized Christ in our neighbors? Just as Dorothy believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, she believed that Christ was equally present in the poor. And so our response to the poor was a test of the authenticity of our worship. How could we love God whom we haven't seen if we didn't love our neighbor whom we have seen? And how could we love our neighbors who are hungry except by feeding them? The mystery of the poor is this, she said, that they are Jesus, and what you do for them, you do to him. But the implications of this doctrine were far more controversial when applied to war. If Christ was present in the disguise of our neighbor, this was also true in his most terrible disguise, in the face of the one we call the enemy. We were told to feed, clothe, and shelter our neighbor, to nurse the sick, to comfort the afflicted. The works of war were the exact opposite of the works of mercy. It was Dorothy's conviction that Jesus had come to offer a radical new definition of love as the ultimate law of our lives. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. It was a new commandment, for the love exemplified on the cross extended beyond our friends and family to embrace even those who would do us harm. Jesus left us a definition of nonviolence not only in his words, but in the manner of his life. By his death and resurrection, he had converted the cross, a sign of defeat, into a symbol of life and hope. And he had come to substitute the cross for the sword or the bomb as an effective instrument of liberation and justice. No doubt this was true folly in the eyes of the world, but we were not told to love up to the point of reason, prudence, or personal safety, but to love unreasonably, foolishly, profligately unto the cross. This, Dorothy believed, was the radical heart of Jesus' message, no matter how scandalous or unreasonable. It was, in the end, the defining message of the gospel. Her pacifism, first expressed during the Spanish Civil War, was maintained throughout World War II and continued in the era of the Cold War in Vietnam, and it caused outrage and scandal, even among many who applauded her wonderful work with the poor. Beginning in the 1950s, the Catholic Workers sponsored numerous protests against the dangers of nuclear war. For her own refusal to cooperate with New York City's compulsory civil defense drills, she served several jail terms. Most Catholics of the time probably thought this was a very foolish gesture. This was at a time when supposedly sane members of the political and military establishment believed that a war that cost the Russians 100 million lives while costing only 50 million of our own would represent a successful outcome. In relation to such thinking, Dorothy did not mind being considered foolish, impractical, or even crazy. From her point of view, policies that were considered prudent, practical, and sane were in fact murderous, suicidal, and blasphemous. She did not expect great things to happen overnight. She knew the slow pace by which change and new life comes. It was, in the phrase she often repeated, by little and by little that we are saved. Of course, by sitting out these civil defense drills and going to jail, Dorothy never supposed that such gestures would bring an end to war. No more than the work of feeding a few hundred hungry people each morning would solve the problems of the Depression. But like Jesus, who spoke of the mysterious potential of a mustard seed, Dorothy believed in the power hidden in small means. In this, she drew surprising lessons from her favorite saint, Therese of Lisieux, a young Carmelite nun, the Little Flower, who died in 1897 at 24 in a small convent in Normandy. Therese called her spiritual path the Little Way. It consisted of performing all the small deeds and obligations of your daily life, suffering all the inconveniences and discomforts in a spirit of love and in the presence of God. In this way, she believed, everyday life with its constant opportunities to exercise patience, forgiveness, and compassion could become an arena for holiness. You didn't have to be in a convent or monastery. You didn't have to face lions in the Roman Colosseum. Everyday life provided the means for sanctification. Furthermore, Therese believed strongly in the spiritual connection that binds all members of the mystical body of Christ. Thus, each sacrifice endured in love, each work of mercy did not just advance one's own path to holiness. It might increase the balance of love in the world. There was no telling what effect our prayers and small sacrifices could have around the globe on people we might never meet. Dorothy came to see in St. Therese not only a great saint, but one with a message particularly suited to our times. Therese spoke to the power of things that are apparently marginal and of little account. She came to appreciate in particular what she called the social implications of Therese's teachings, the significance of all the little things we do or fail to do. This included the protests we make, appearing foolish while standing on a street corner with a sign for peace, or handing out a leaflet, or going to jail for a few days or months or even years. These gestures, though apparently foolish and ineffective, no more than a pebble in a pond, might send forth ripples that could transform the world. In the gospel, this principle is illustrated in the story of Jesus' multiplication of the loaves and fishes. Dorothy drew on that image for the title of one of her books, Loaves and Fishes, where she wrote, "One of the greatest evils of the day is the sense of futility. Young people say, what can one person do? What is the sense of our small effort? They cannot see that we must lay one brick at a time, take one step at a time. We can be responsible only for the action of the present moment, but we can beg for an increase of love in our hearts that will vitalize and transform all our individual actions, and know that God will take them and multiply them as Jesus multiplied the loaves and fishes." She summed this all up in one of her most frequently cited lines: "The greatest challenge of the day is this: how to bring about a revolution of the heart, a revolution which has to start with each one of us." A central feature of almost every issue of the Catholic Worker was Dorothy's column on pilgrimage, a sometimes sprawling chronicle of people and places she had visited, part meditation, part editorial, and an account of daily life among the insulted and injured. Her column might fill half the pages of the paper. As she wrote in one of her columns, "We must overflow in writing about all the things we've been talking about and living during the month. Writing is an act of community. It's a letter. It is comforting, consoling, helping, advising on our part, as well as asking it on yours. It is a part of our human association with each other. is an expression of our love and concern for each other. There was a literal basis to the title of Dorothy's column. Since the early years of the movement, she often spent as much as half her life away from home and on her way to somewhere else. When traveling, she noted she was careful to bring her Bible, her missal, and a jar of instant coffee, all of them, quote, essential. With authority, she cited St. Teresa's words, "Life is a night spent in an uncomfortable inn." Few of Dorothy's nights on the road were spent in inns, but she was well acquainted with uncomfortable buses and untrustworthy cars. As she could boast in the manner of St. Paul, "I have had clutch rods come out in my hands, gas pedals go down through the floor, batteries fall out into the roadside, windshield wipers fail in cloudbursts, lights go out, fan belts break, etc., etc. Some of these things happened after inspection." Yet the word pilgrimage did not merely allude to her frequent travels. Jim Forrest, a former Catholic Worker editor, tied Dorothy's use of the word to the sense of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. It meant that, quote, "Every day of one's life and all that happened along the way, planned and unexpected, were segments of a heavenward pilgrimage, so long as the guiding principle was to live the gospel and to discover Christ in those whom one encountered." Pilgrimage for Dorothy was a way of life, a mode of listening, an attitude that motivated choices, a discipline of being. Her columns might include references to many of the great peacemakers and prophets of social justice, but they were just as likely to describe time with her grandchildren or with people who would leave no great mark on history, even those whom the world would call expendable. Dorothy often liked to quote the line of St. Catherine of Siena, "All the way to heaven is heaven, because he said, 'I am the way.'" She invited her readers to join her on this journey, part of her ongoing effort to relate her faith to the needs and the signs of the times. In her diaries, which I edited, we see how this practice played out in her daily life as she held out daily activities, her encounters, her shifting moods, her examination of conscience as the material for spiritual reflection. In one entry, she makes an inventory of her faults: lack of charity, criticism of superiors, of neighbors, of friends and enemies, idle talk, impatience, lack of self-control, pride and presumption, self-will, desire not to be corrected, to have one's own way, impatience in thought and speech. Someone once told Dorothy to hold her temper, and she said, "I hold more temper in 1 minute than you will in your entire life." The title I gave to her diary is "The Duty of Delight," is taken from a phrase she liked to repeat. It appears in the postscript of her autobiography, where she writes, "It's not easy always to be joyful, to keep in mind the duty of delight." It says a lot about Dorothy's spirituality. It's one thing to love people who are lovable. It's one thing to feel delight when things are delightful. But the heart of the gospel is adding love even when there is no love. Loving the person beside you, even if that person is disagreeable. Living for so many years in a fractious community made up of so many broken and damaged souls was a truly heroic undertaking. But if you willed to love someone, if you willed to see Christ in them, you could do it, so Dorothy believed. That didn't mean it was any easier for her than for the rest of us. Yet it was the exercise of her faith in these small ways, the effort to live her daily life in the conscious presence of God, that equipped her for the extraordinary and heroic actions she performed on a wider stage. I noted that it sometimes happens in our life that a door opens up and lets the future in. For me, that occurred 50 years ago this summer, in 1975, when I first encountered Dorothy Day. I was 19, and I'd taken a year's leave from college, intending to spend a few months at St. Joseph's House. A number of motivations drew me. I was eager to experience something of life firsthand, not just from books. I was tired of living for myself alone and longed to give myself to something larger and more meaningful. I had a pretty good idea of what I was against. I wanted to find out what my life was for. Dorothy was familiar with such motivations. "What's it all about, the Catholic Worker Movement?" she asked in one of her last columns. It is, in a way, a school, a work camp to which large-hearted, socially conscious young people come to find their vocations. After some months or years, They know most definitely what they want to do with their lives. They learn not only to love with compassion, but to overcome fear. As it turned out, my plan to stay just a few months ended up stretching out to 5 years, which turned out to be the last 5 years of Dorothy's life. And in the end, I found much of what I'd been seeking and perhaps much more. I'd only been at St. Joseph House a few months when Dorothy asked me to serve as managing editor of the newspaper. She was largely in retirement, and the management of the paper and the day-to-day work of the hospitality house were in the hands of those she called the young people. At 20, I qualified as young. Otherwise, I had no evident qualifications otherwise for such a task. I wasn't even a Catholic at the time. My appointment evidently had more to do with the fact that nobody else was particularly interested in the job. Nevertheless, one of the first things I learned about Dorothy was her ability to recognize and encourage people's gifts and possibilities. Possibilities, I should say, that weren't at all evident to ourselves. Though I was privileged to know Dorothy, most of what I've come to understand about Dorothy Day has come from her writings. I've just finished the 6th volume, her spiritual writings. But without a doubt, I learned the most about her from the opportunity to edit her diaries and selected letters. From these volumes, I learned in particular about the spirituality that was expressed in the ordinary events and encounters of her daily life. Many people associate Dorothy Day with dramatic actions on the public stage, walking on picket lines, refusing to take shelter during civil defense drills, standing beside young men who were burning their draft cards during the Vietnam War, or being arrested at the age of 75 while picketing with striking farm workers in California. From that final arrest, many are familiar with a famous photograph by Bob Fitch that shows her calmly sitting on a portable stool, offset by the outline of 2 burly and well-armed police officers. It was that iconic image of contemplation and action as much as anything that first attracted me to the worker. Of course, we also associate Dorothy with the work of the Catholic worker, putting out a newspaper, living among the poor, practicing the works of mercy. But reading and editing her diary showed me that those activities were only the public face of a life that was mostly spent, as it is for all great souls, as well as the rest of us, in very ordinary and undramatic activities. And it was especially in that realm of ordinary daily life that she expressed her spirituality and found her path to holiness. Now, through her writings, anyone can know Dorothy in this way, but still there are a few things about her that I think you could only know from spending time with her. For one thing, her intense curiosity and interest in life. Part of this came from the habits of a journalist accustomed to carrying around a notebook to jot down facts and details of about the places she went and the people she met. She never seemed bored or jaded. She was endlessly fascinated by other people, where they came from, what they'd read, what they cared about. "What's your favorite novel of Dostoevsky?" she might ask. I think I told her The Brothers Karamazov, a book I had not actually read, though I was happy to learn that she agreed with me. She had a great spirit of adventure. Always she seemed ready for something new, whether starting a house of hospitality for women in her 70s, standing up to the IRS when they took her to task for refusing to pay federal income taxes for war. When an exasperated IRS agent asked her to estimate how much she owed in taxes, she replied, "Why don't you just tell me how much I owe, and then I just won't pay it?" Regardless of how old she became, there was always a youthfulness to her. She loved the idealism and energy of young people and what she called their instinct for the heroic. She urged us to aim for the impossible, noting that if we lowered our goal, we would also diminish our effort. Yet she was understanding of our mistakes and foibles. The memory of her own youthful struggles made her particularly sensitive to the searching and sufferings of youth. She herself was always ready to be inspired and renewed. In her diary, she wrote, "No matter how old I get, no matter how feeble, short of breath, incapable of walking more than a few blocks, with all these symptoms of age and decrepitude, my heart can still leap for joy as I read and suddenly assent to some great truth enunciated by some great mind and heart." For Dorothy, all of life was a school of charity and gratitude. Exercising the duty of delight, she always seemed to look past the surface of things to another wider dimension. Quote, "There is desperate suffering with the prospect of relief," she wrote, "but we would be contributing to the misery and desperation of the world if we failed to rejoice in the sun, the moon, and the stars, in the rivers which surround the island on which we live, in the cool breezes of the bay, in what food we have, and in the benefactors God sends us." She was an avid collector of picture postcards, and some of them adorned the walls of her room in Mary House. They included icons and works of art, but also images from nature, forests, the ocean, polar bears. Dorothy spent most of her life surrounded by actual images of poverty, including the hungry men and women who waited outside the Catholic worker each morning for a bowl of soup. But one of her most distinctive qualities was her sensitivity to beauty. She delighted in the beauty in church or listening to the Saturday afternoon opera on the radio. But she also noticed beauty in places that others might overlook, in a piece of driftwood, in the sound of a tanker on the Hudson, an ailanthus tree somehow clinging to life in the midst of a slum, the sunlight on the windows of a neighboring tenement building. But she also had an eye for moral beauty, the sight of someone sharing bread with a neighbor, the literal meaning of companionship. And hardest of all, she could see beauty where others did not, in the features of Jesus under the disguise of the poor and downtrodden. She frequently quoted Dostoevsky's famous line, "The world will be saved by beauty." I often puzzled over what that meant. Once when I was fasting in a jail in Colorado, she sent me a postcard with an aerial photo of Cape Cod with the message, "I hope this card refreshes you and does not tantalize you." It occurred to me that Dorothy believed that beauty itself had a moral dimension. To direct our attention to beauty, or even the recollection of it, while sitting in a slum or a jail cell or a hermitage, could inspire us to greater courage, hope, and love. The world would not be saved by pretty things. It would be saved by our capacity to see beneath the surface of things, to see reality in its ultimate depths, as God saw it and pronounced it good. And that leads me to one last thing, which comes as a surprise to those who only know her through her dour expression in photographs, and that is how much fun it was to be with her. She had a tremendous sense of humor and a girlish laugh. John Court, who joined the Catholic worker soon after graduating from Harvard in the early 1930s, was drawn to the movement after witnessing how much fun Dorothy seemed to be having. Here's a woman who appeared to be pretty old, at the time she was in her mid-30s, who seemed to be having the time of her life, and he wanted a share of that. The long loneliness ends with a meditation in which she says, "We were just sitting around talking when everything happened, when Peter Morin came in, when lines of people began to form, when someone said, 'Let's all go and live on a farm.'" She says, "It was as casual as all that, I often think. It just came about. It just happened." And that's one of the things you had to experience for yourself being around Dorothy. The unexpected things that could begin in a conversation as you just sat around talking. The way that history or your own life could suddenly take a turn as you were just sitting around the kitchen table over a cup of coffee or a bowl of soup. When you lived your life in the spirit of pilgrimage, everything had a providential character. It often seems that way for me too when I look back on my life. It just happened. And the talk and the witness and the daily acts of faith and love continued long after I had moved on. "You will know your vocation," Dorothy once said, "by the joy it gives you." It was evidently not my vocation to remain serving soup at the Catholic worker, but evidently it was my vocation to become an editor, in fact, incredibly enough, Dorothy's editor. And that has given me great joy. Thank you very much.
Robert, you have made her come alive for us. And the question you asked, what would the world look like if we loved as Jesus loved? If we saw our lives as a pilgrimage, and that the road to heaven itself, that God is always with us, and that the saints are not these plaster statues that we have in our churches. Saints are flesh and blood with history and with passion, with desires, with tragedies, with joy, and with hope. Thank you for bringing her alive, making her alive for us today. Will you be open to responding to some questions or comments? Always. I think you've left us in a meditative, contemplative
asleep.
in action. Bill, do you want to stand up?
Robert, could you update us on the present status of her canonization process, and how's that looking, and what your hopes are?
This has been a long process. I was involved in this from the beginning in 1997, the centenary of Dorothy's birth. And some of us who knew her were invited by Cardinal O'Connor to talk about whether it was appropriate to promote her cause for canonization. And it was a very moving experience. And after a couple of meetings of that sort, he said he was convinced, and he had always admired her. He said, could not forgive myself if I prevented what God evidently wants. So he was one of the last things he did before he died was to submit her name for consideration, and it was approved, and she, thus on the first rung of this process, became Servant of God, Dorothy Day. A few years later, the Dorothy Day Guild was established by Cardinal Egan to help promote interest and awareness of her legacy and her cause. And that got off to a kind of slow start, but it is really thriving now, and I do urge you to come and look at the petitions there and the literature that's available, and take a holy card and maybe sign up and become a member of the Guild. They have a wonderful newsletter that comes out and keep you informed, not just about events in the cause of Dorothy Day, but about the themes and the issues that Dorothy cared about. Finally, then, Cardinal Dolan established a historical commission, so-called, of which I was a member, to oversee the compilation of all the material that had to be done. There's interviews with people who knew her, there's a biography, there's the very laborious collection of all of her writings, including diaries that had to be transcribed verbatim, not edited the way I did it. And when that was finally completed about 2.5 years ago in December, there was a big ceremony at St. Patrick's Cathedral to send off this massive number of crates to Rome, where there's a postulator waiting to work on it to boil this all down and convert it into the official kind of case for her canonization, which would go to the Congregation on Saints. And that's been a slow process, I have to say, but evidently reaching the final stages now of having that completed, working with the congregation in Rome to make sure everything's in order. So that's where that is. You'll remember that Pope Francis, has kind of tipped his hat when he came to the United States in 2015 and spoke at before Congress, and he organized his whole speech around what he called 4 Great Americans. It's a speech that really bears rereading again, because he really talked about what it is that makes a country great, and that was before that became a political mantra in this country. And Dorothy Day was one of the people, along with Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, and Thomas Merton, that he cited. That was exciting enough. Just a couple of years ago, the Vatican Publishing House reprinted her book, From Union Square to Rome, an Italian edition, for which Pope Francis wrote the foreword. So there's no question that he's following this carefully. I hope it would be wonderful, in my view, if he could be the one to declare her venerable, which would be the next step. And after that, then it enters into the realm of miracles and all that sort of thing. But I could talk all night about that subject, why I feel she merits a canonization, not because it's something she earned, but because the kind of distinctive holiness that she represented, I think, is an incredible gift to the church and widens the church. There are those who fear that it would diminish her to be kind of conformed to this bureaucratic kind of process. I tend to think there are people like a Dorothy Day or a Franz Jägerstätter or an Oscar Romero. Their canonization enlarges the church. And of course, it falls on us to keep on remembering the real person and not to allow her to become one of those plaster saints. But that's, that's my job. So as long as I have breath. So anyway, that's that story. Yes?
Because of the live stream, it's good that we have everything on.
Yes, hi. How would you say is the status of the present Catholic worker movement in the world? Are there still young men and women from Harvard or from City College going and joining the Catholic worker?
Well, Catholic Worker has always been a decentralized movement. It's not a franchise kind of operation. The communities in New York are, in a sense, the flagship, since that's where it started and that's where the newspaper is published. And Mary House and St. Joseph House are still there, even while the kind of neighborhood becomes gentrified and the social conditions change. There's still homelessness, there's still hunger, there's still a soup line and works of mercy, there's still the newspaper that comes out, and also still the protests and the witness for peace and social justice. All those things as urgent as ever. There are, I don't know, a very large number, 150 or so communities around the country that identify themselves as Catholic worker houses. But they sometimes have different emphases, different size. Some of them are quite large operations, like the house in Los Angeles has its own newspaper and all kinds of things it does. Some of them emphasize the farming kind of tradition of the Catholic worker, others the hospitality, defined in one way or another. But it still is a vision or a way that a lot of people find compelling and attractive, and especially I think to some extent still young people who are looking for something challenging and are prepared to kind of step off the well-beaten track to experience living in voluntary poverty and simplicity among the poor, and offering this kind of faith-filled witness to sacredness of life and to encounter Christ in the poor. It's still a compelling model. You could compare it to other religious communities that also are smaller and not as vital as they were at the time in the 14th century when Franciscan fever swept all of Europe. These things come and go with different kind of rhythms. But it's remarkable, really, that something that started on such an anarchistic, model without any rules or admission process or novitiate or anything like that, just sort of open to whoever comes in the door, it has. For that very reason, there's an amazing stability in the culture of the Catholic worker. You can walk into a Catholic worker house anywhere, and it just has a certain vibe that same kind of cast of characters. Some of them seem like they're out of a novel of Dostoevsky, and some of them are saints, and some of them are holy fools, and some of them are workers, and some of them are slackers, as Stanley Vishnevsky used to say. But I think it still has meaning. It still offers a prophetic witness, as I said, not as a solution to all the problems in the world, but as a kind of planting seeds of awareness and consciousness. Yes.
Hi. Sainthood and family doesn't seem to go well together, and I guess the daughter Tamar was an involuntary victim of this path, no? And the question is, later in life, would she have changed something? Did she ever share something about that?
Would who have changed? I'm sorry.
Well, I understand that her daughter eventually left the church and in a way did not enjoy the life. But I'm not sure if there's anything that you can share about that.
Well, I'm not sure it's for me to go into that. I do highly urge you to read a wonderful book by Dorothy's granddaughter called Saved by Beauty. It's the story of her mother, Tamar, Dorothy's daughter, and her grandmother, Dorothy, and a fascinating window into Dorothy through the lens of her relationship with her daughter. Very revealing about Dorothy's humanity. In fact, I take great comfort and encouragement in the fact that Dorothy wasn't perfect at everything she did and didn't pretend to be. And if saints were all judged on their parenting skills, yeah, they might really, devil's advocate would have lots to say. Dorothy loved Tamar, and Tamar loved Dorothy, and there were many aspects of the Catholic worker life that Tamar very much did love, the crafts and the farming and the hospitality. But I think as a young person, that the kind of austere piety of the worker, especially in the 1940s when Dorothy was going through the retreat movements and everything, a lot of emphasis on asceticism and self-denial and mortification and that sort of thing, that was very difficult for Tamar. So I refer you to the book to kind of answer that question more deeply.
Actually, Kate Hennessy spoke here a few years ago in the lecture series, and it was a very beautiful testimony.
I mean, it's significant that, I mean, Tamar had 9 children, and 2 of her granddaughters, Kate, I mean, is really an artist and a writer who has devoted her, kind of followed in Dorothy's spirit as a writer, and has created this wonderful book. So very much affected by her grandmother's influence. And then Martha Hennessy, who is a part of the Catholic worker community here, has followed very much in Dorothy's path of peace witness. She was imprisoned for a year or so for act of civil disobedience at a nuclear submarine base. But there are, Dorothy she said, I was the barren mother of children who became, the joyful mother of many. I consider myself one of those children who, not entirely faithful to her way, but whose life has been entirely guided by her vision and her inspiration.
Robert, thank you for very enlightening, inspiring, and personal sharing with us to make Dorothy Day come alive. And God bless you. And God bless your wife, Monica, who is here. There she is.
We have copies of the book here to sell.
And she will be selling, she's the cashier, she'll be selling books here, and Robert will be happy to sign them as well. Thank you all so much.